Hello, thanks for joining me, astrologer Patrick Arundell. I'd like to talk today about the eclipses of July 2019. The solar eclipse, which occurs in Cancer on the 2nd, is going to provide a backdrop of energy for the last 6 months of 2019. And the lunar eclipse, which occurs on the 16th, is in the opposite sign of Cancer, of Capricorn, and is going to be alongside Pluto, the planet of change, the planet of transformation. So July does promise to be a very powerful month. The solar eclipse also coincides with Mars, the planet of desire, relocating into the glamour sign of Leo. Mars in this location is very much about creating a greater sense of drama, a greater presence. But really, the solar eclipse is very much more to do with the inner parts of our world. It is to do with our feelings. And the wonderful thing about this solar eclipse is that it is going to enable us to move forwards around the things where we gain an instinctive desire. So it's about listening to our inner voice, our sixth sense. And it can supercharge us, particularly if you are more attuned to how you feel about things. But it is true to say that on the other side of the heavens continues the two power brokers of the outer zodiac, the higher octave planets of Saturn and Pluto, which are only a couple of degrees apart in Capricorn and therefore hugely influential. Saturn, of course, is very much about structures, but it's also about conditioning, and in the sign of Capricorn, which it rules, it's very much to do with traditionality. Pluto, on the other hand, is very much about change. It can be about secrets. It can also be about power, raw power. So if we put them very close together, there may be certain orthodoxies and traditional patterns that have existed for many years that are actually being challenged by this conjunction. Now they're peering across the heavens in opposition to the sun's location in Cancer. So although that solar eclipse itself is not being impacted by Saturn and Pluto, by week 2, the sun in Cancer has moved forwards and is in opposition to Saturn. This is one of the most important of all planetary transits. So the desire to create that nurturing environment has to be reconciled against the more worldly energies of Saturn, which is about rules and regulations. It's about authority. It's about doing things as they were always done, the conditioning. So even if we want to embrace a more healing, emotional part of our beings, we still have to balance that against the expectations of the real world. And that's where Saturn's coming from. So it does depend on your unique personal horoscope and where these two are located and in which houses. But in terms of the general zodiac, the Sun is in the 4th solar house and Saturn and Pluto are in the 10th. So what we have here is a balance that needs to be struck between the desire of the solar eclipse, which is going to be pulsating through the heavens in this last part of the year, with the more stern, reactive and traditional energies of Saturn. And it could be, therefore, that some energy can get really slowed down. We could feel a sense of inhibition in week 2 of this month. And there's more than this, because the emotional pull of the heavens comes from the North Node. And this is also known as the point of destiny. And from the 7th of November last year, this inverted into the sign of Cancer. And right through this month, the North Node is going to be opposed by Saturn. So the sun and the solar eclipse is very much about desire and action. It's more masculine. The moon is very much about the North Node. It's about how we feel. It's almost like the point of a compass needle. And that's just pulling us towards a more nurturing way of being. But that is going to be challenged by this orthodox, rather stern, restrictive, and maybe obstacle providing energies of Saturn. And that's in all of the month, That's going to be opposite the North Node the whole of the month. What's going to offset this is that Neptune, the planet of dreams, imagination, photography and film, is in a magical location in Pisces, one of the sign it rules. And its angle, its trine with the North Node, is actually very enabling. And ironically, the role of Neptune in its angle to Saturn is actually broadly very helpful. So what we've got here is a situation where there is a chance to evolve, to grow around our emotional needs, to develop a world which is more balanced, particularly in terms of the environment, because I think Cancer really does rule that. And of course, being ruled by the moon, it's also very much in tune with the tides and the seas and rivers. So we're talking about things like pollution. So I think we are going to see a polarity going on between those who've got a raised consciousness about making this world a better place to be and ensuring its long-term survival, and basically the desire of big business and big government to maintain the status quo for the short-term need, which is driven very much by this Capricornian energy and the combination between Saturn and Pluto. So it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't embrace these opportunities. And obviously we are seeing a growing consciousness that's coming out into the world with people becoming much more aware that our own individual actions can have an impact on the overall whole. So that's good. That means that we can take this Cancerian energy and do some healing for ourselves. It's not just about what happens at a corporate, global or governmental level. But I do feel that we may all encounter someone who's quite restrictive or quite limited in their response to any need to be much more evolved, much more open, much more healing, much more in tune with feelings. So it is going to be important to have realistic expectations, despite the fact that the North Node's angle with Neptune can really see us being much more idealistic in certain moments. But on the 4th of this month, well, Venus moves into Cancer too. Now that's a really interesting transit because it points here, Venus is very much to do with what we attract. In its transit here through to the 27th of July, we have an opportunity to make sure that our immediate environment is as pleasing and soothing as possible. So don't be surprised if you find yourself redecorating, buying new furnishings, recycling, upcycling, or perhaps doing things to your outdoor space, particularly if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. However, it is also true to say that on the 2nd, the rather desirous energies of Mars, which is all about instant gratification, does move into Leo, which is a very grand location for this planet. It's going to be here through to the middle of August. And this is very dramatic, it's very operatic, it's very much about performance. So it could be that we're going to see some people standing up for protecting the environment and nature and environmentalism and ecology by doing something in a creative way, which could perhaps be through some kind of concert, fundraising, or just important and influential people raising their heads above the parapet to join in with the growing movement towards protecting our resources. However, Mercury, the planet of communication, starts this month also in the sign of Leo, but slams on the brakes and goes into a retrograde on the 7th. By the 18th, it's actually inverted and moves back on the 19th into the sign of Cancer. It's not actually it's going to come to the end of the retrograde by the end of this month, by the end of July, but actually it won't come out of shadow until the middle of August. But Mercury retrograde, of course, is going to provide plenty of opportunities for cross wires, for industrial action, which affects travel, distribution, and immediate communications in our personal relationships. But also, I think it's important to understand that Jupiter, the planet of growth and of travel, is continuing to be in a retrograde, along with Saturn and Pluto, and in fact is in a right angle with Neptune, right through to the 3rd week of the month. Now this particular right angle suggests that something that we find difficult could be very easily blown completely out of proportion. So it is going to be important to keep one toe on terra firma, even if something does seem rather overwhelming. And then on the 16th of the month, we do have the pivot to the solar eclipse. We have the lunar eclipse, which occurs in Capricorn. But what makes this particularly influential is it does embrace the energies of Pluto. If we think Pluto is about regeneration, it's also, therefore, potentially about death. Because of the moon being close to Pluto, I think we're going to see in the following 6 months some things that have had quite an orthodox role of authority actually losing that power in some way, or our own personal consciousness is going to rise up to such a point that our desire to have our voice heard, which is the 10th house, very much to do with public interactions, it's going to give us a huge desire to have our voice heard, especially if we're motivated by anything to do with protecting the foundations, the base, the home, where we can feel nurtured, which is the 4th house, of course, ruled by Cancer. But then from the 11th through to the 17th, the sun's going into an opposition with Pluto. And of course, that's why we end up with the lunar eclipse, when the sun and the moon are in opposition. And this is particularly important because the sun's about growth. It's about all that drives us forwards. Pluto can be about power, it can be about transformation, but it can be about things coming to an end. So there may be some kind of power battle that's manifested either within yourself or within your relationships, or your relationships to a certain way of living. So we may find ourselves changing our patterns that have been long established, perhaps even those conditionings which were put into us when we were very, very young. And I feel there is a marvellous opportunity for change, but it's probably not going to be painless, because when the sun and Pluto are in opposition, some kind of battle of wills is usually played out. Just in a personal context, you may encounter someone who's very opinionated, the kind of right is might character, who wags their fingers, doesn't like to listen to anyone else's viewpoint, likes to steamroll their ideas through. This may actually echo out, because we do have a lot of voices dominating the news channels and social media of people who have very powerful points to make. But it is going to be important, if you do encounter someone like that and you feel that they're almost trying to bully you, that you do stand your ground, that you try to find the middle ground between the power of Pluto and the energy of the sun. And that means reinforcing your boundaries and not just being swept away. It is true to say that Venus is going to go opposite Saturn and also Pluto in week 3 of this month. And I do think that's going to work out much more at a personal level. If there's a personal relationship where there does need to be a realignment of the power between you and your partner, if you have one, or friend, or family member, this can be a crunch time. But also with Venus opposite Pluto, someone may offer something that seems to be absolutely wonderful, but just watch out that there isn't some kind of hidden catch, because something can be hidden with Pluto. It's the planet of secrets, and it's also in the 7th house of Cancer, very much to do with open enemies. So do watch out for who you're coming up against, whether it's rivals at work, people who tends to not necessarily have your best interests at heart. A robust response is going to be necessary. But then the sun moves into its home zone. It arrives home on the 23rd into the sign of Leo. And this is going to be a moment to truly celebrate. Now Venus is going to be joining up on the 28th, and there's also going to be a new moon in Leo on the 31st, but not before Mercury in its inversion goes back into an opposition with Saturn, which it actually first had in June. So if you do find yourself still having some battles of will towards the end of the month, it wouldn't be a surprise. However, it is true to say that as this month comes to a close, it is an opportunity to move into a sunnier, more sociable, more outgoing phase of the year. But how we feel about things, how our instincts are driven, is still going to be crucially important to our progress for the rest of the year. It's been a real pleasure being with me. Thank you for joining me. Good luck and goodbye for now.